The Committee on Planning, Development, and Transportation. I am proud to be the chair of this committee. My name is Michelle Wu. I'm City Councillor at Large, and I'm joined by the sponsors of this docket, District Councillor Ed Flynn, City Councillor at Large Michael Flaherty, as well as our other at-large colleague, Anissa Asabi George. A few housekeeping matters. I want to remind everyone that this public hearing is being recorded and broadcast live. Channels Comcast 8, RCN 82, and Verizon 1964, as well as streaming on the City of Boston website. Please silence your cell phones and other devices. We will take public testimony throughout the hearing. I'll start with just a few of the folks who have signed up already, and if you feel moved to add your name to sign up at any time to testify, please add your name to the sheets near the door. And just a note for those who will testify, please state your name, address, and affiliation for the record, and keep your testimony to 2 minutes or fewer. Today's hearing is on docket number 1273, order for a hearing regarding the South Boston Waterfront and the South Boston Seaport Transit Strategic Plan. So I would like to offer each of my colleagues the opportunity to give an opening statement. Then again, we'll go to about 3 people for public testimony and then over to the administration panel. We'll then take a few more people. It looks like there's only 5 total signed up, so the next 2 after that, in between the 2 panels, and then potentially call in some folks from other agencies and organizations to join us for more questions. Councillor Ed Flynn.
Thank you, Councillor Wu, for your strong leadership on this issue, and I'd also like to thank my good friend and colleague, Michael Flaherty, as well, for your leadership. I'd also like to thank the residents from the Fort Point Neighborhood Association that have been working hard on this exact issue. Joe, Sarah, Tom, for their attention and concern when it comes to all the issues in Fort Point and the South Boston waterfront as it relates to transportation. We're here today because we have unprecedented commercial and residential growth at the South Boston waterfront. The area in no way resembles its appearance even 5 or 10 years ago. We're thankful for growth in our city, but with the substantial growth comes additional vehicles, congestion, public safety concerns for our pedestrians, motorists, and cyclists. First, my primary focus as the District 2 City Councilor has always been public safety. I want to discuss traffic calming and safety for our pedestrians, motorists, and cyclists in this area. We've had several crashes this year in South Boston, not far from here. 1 tragic and some near misses. So I think this has to be our #1 focus in all matters. Vision Zero. Second, transparency in community process is very important to me. Councillor Flaherty and I believe that residents who live in the neighborhood should have a say as to what takes place in their neighborhood. We need to see that what the community process will look like as it relates to this plan for our neighbors in Fort Point and throughout the South Boston waterfront. I would like to see them have the opportunity to weigh in with their concerns due to their experiences living there. It's their neighborhood. That they can get an update of where things currently stand. We'd also like to see what the timeline for the projects would be. I'd also like to respectfully ask a comprehensive traffic study for the Northern Avenue Bridge as well. Lastly, traffic and congestion is a top issue in this area. I know we already have opened up the bypass road. I would like to get your feedback and ideas on how we can help alleviate some of these issues for our residents. I want to thank the panelists for being here this morning. Thank you, Councilor Wu.
Thank you, Councillor Flynn. Councillor Flaherty.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and obviously thank you to the co-lead sponsor, Councilor Flynn, as well. And also for the folks that are taking time out of their schedules, obviously, as we're coming down to crunch time this part of the year. At the June 14th BPDA meeting, the board unanimously authorized the advertisement and issuance of a request for proposal for consulting services to assist the BPDA staff on the South Boston Seaport Strategic Transit Plan. The plan is described in this memo that's titled "A Request for Proposal for Consulting Services for the South Boston Seaport Transit Strategic Plan" as a collaborative effort between multiple agencies that will include the public and stakeholder coordination, both interdepartmental and interagency and community. And I know that there's several folks here in attendance. I know there's representatives from Massport, from the BCEC, from 4 Point Channel, as well as some landlords, other stakeholders, and some tenants. So the primary intent of today's hearing through the chair is to receive an update about the ongoing collaborative efforts between the multiple agencies, as well as a discussion on how community input has been solicited and will be solicited in the future. I'm also looking forward to a discussion about how the South Boston Seaport Transit Strategic Plan will build on the South Boston Waterfront Sustainable Transportation Plan, as well as get updates on progress that's been made on a menu of both short, medium, and long-term recommendations that were made in that plan, as well as plans for future transit solutions in this area. And I know that Rick Domino is here as well, that I've invited to talk about some of the work that he's been doing in collaboration with everyone here from A Better City. So again, look forward to a spirited discussion. I'm also aware that there's the terms of sort of matching funds, and I know that there was a $400,000 figure that was thrown out there, and I know that there'll also been mention about Silver Line capacity and whether that's part of this plan, and there's also mention in that memo about other matching funds. So if anyone can sort of bring some clarity to what funds are available, what are the sources of those funds, sort of who are the matching participants and parties in those funds, and more importantly, can we get going on this? I know that this was already supposed to happen in the memo. It was supposed to be done by September, and it was going to be a 9-month process. So I also need to know, when does that clock start? Does that clock start today? Has the clock already started and the funds are just catching up to the process? So those would be answers that I'd be looking to try to get today through the chair. So I appreciate your time and attention and look forward to the testimony.
Thank you, Councillor Flaherty. Councillor Sabi George.
I don't have any, save my voice for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So welcome to our panel from the administration. You know the drill very, very well. Chief Osgood, would you like to start?
Sure. So thank you so much, Councillor Wu, councillors, for having us here. You've actually assembled a really terrific group of folks in this room, myself excluded from that list, who really can answer a tremendous number of the questions that you've raised. To speak specifically to what you'd raised, Councillor Flaherty, Jim Fitzgerald from the BPDA will be speaking in a moment. I'm joined as well by Commissioner Fiandaca as well as Pat Hoey. I'm going to do sort of a very quick summary of just some of the work that has been done, is ongoing, is planned in the future, just so you get a sense of the full context, and then we'll talk specifically about the transit plan. I would say that the South Boston Waterfront is really the beneficiary of 3 big things. One is a foundational plan, that 2015 South Boston Waterfront Sustainable Transportation Plan.
Chief, I am so sorry. This is my fault. I completely forgot. I meant to go from councillor statements to the 3 members of the public.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, and this is on me. I totally skipped over it. I'm not thinking. So if I could just pause you there, and I'm sorry, you'll probably have to repeat those 2 sentences. But I did mean to call down Richard Martini, Mark O'Leary, and Andy Paul. Oh, Andy from MassDOT, I think you'll be on. We'll ask you later. So Richard and Mark. Oh, Mark is from MCCA, okay, we're going to do Richard, Mark, I think, and Andy will ask later. So Richard, Tony Lechuga, and Pat Sullivan.
Hi, thank you, councilors. My name is Richard Martini with the Fallon Company. Have worked in the neighborhood for more than 20 years, and I'm also a resident of the Seaport. Actually have had a couple of meetings recently with a lot of the residents in 22 and 50 Liberty talking about this very issue, including the Northern Avenue Bridge. I just want to talk in support of the initiatives that are underway. Obviously, this is not unique to the city. There's a lot of traffic throughout the city. But with the growth, there's obviously a lot of more immediate concerns. It's been very quick in terms of occurring. We've recently, about a year ago, got police officers in the neighborhood, which is a terrific addition, very well received by the neighborhood. I think the key really that I want to emphasize is trying to get to the short-term goals as quickly as we can, short solutions that can solve problems. And I just want to add, and it's probably really not part of the plan, so I apologize, but one of the things that did come out of the recent meeting with all the residents was frankly just simple enforcement. And however we resolve the enforcement issues between police, cadets, transportation department, whatever we need to do to get people to not block the box, to get people to not double park everywhere on Northern Ave and Seaport Boulevard. That's frankly one of the bigger short-term concerns that everyone brings up all the time. So I really appreciate the ability to testify here and look forward to seeing the results. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Tony?
Hi, thank you. My name is Tony Lechuga. I'm a resident of South Boston, but I'm also here representing the organization Livable Streets. I want to speak to the fact that we've already done quite a bit of planning in this area in terms of the South Boston Sustainable Waterfront Transportation Plan, as well as Imagine Boston 2030. And I would question why within those plans the community feels like there has been a lack of timelines, a lack of budgets, and a lack of accountability. Councillor Flynn spoke to transparency in the process. You also spoke to the idea that traffic and congestion are the biggest concerns for people in that area. And as a resident, I can contest to that being the case. One of the questions that I would ask then is, we know that building more roads and accommodating more cars is not going to be an answer to alleviating this. What we need is better public transit in the area. So I would ask, in the terms of the Seaport Transit Strategic Plan, what does the City of Boston define as transit? What we know right now is that there are limited public transportation options in the Seaport. What we do have a lot of that are valuable and serve lots of human beings are private shuttles. Unfortunately, those are not public transit in our perspective. Those are private transit. And any projects that we continue to pursue that prioritize those private transit options, while they are beneficial to those particular businesses and employees, are not beneficial to someone who's coming in for a job interview. They are not serving the public good. With that in mind, I would question, how is the MBTA involved in this process? They're currently working on a Better Buses initiative. In what way are we trying to improve bus service through the Seaport? That's an essential resource that we could be using better. With that, I would also ask, in what way are we pursuing some of the early action items that would prioritize public transit through this area? Both the South Boston Sustainable Waterfront Transportation Plan and Go Boston 2030 identify Congress Street as an appropriate BRT corridor. Why are we not having that discussion? Why is that not a project that is moving forward? And where is the funding for that type of project? In terms of transparency, I want to push a little bit on some issues that have come up recently, specifically around the Northern Avenue Bridge, as that process is reflective of the general processes of planning in the Seaport. Our organization for months has been trying to get our hands on the data behind the plan in order to compare existing conditions assumed in the plan to existing conditions now. We have been told time and again that that data simply doesn't exist. That doesn't reflect a very transparent process. We've also been asking for months about the finances for the bridge, both at a municipal, state, and federal level, and been told that those will be forthcoming. These reflect problems with transparency in the process. Thank you for the chance to testify. I hope that some of these questions can be addressed.
Thank you, Tony. Pat?
Good morning, Chairperson Wu, members of the council, and thank you, Councillors Flaherty and Flynn, for your leadership on these issues and for calling this hearing. My name is Patrick Sullivan. I'm the Executive Director of the Seaport Transportation Management Association. We're an association of over 50 employers in the South Boston waterfront that work to improve mobility options and transit options in the district. I'm here today to voice my support for the South Boston Seaport Transit Strategic Plan and to express our organization's desire to see this project commence as soon as possible. The commercial, residential, and industrial growth occurring in the South Boston waterfront has contributed immensely to the economy of both the City of Boston and the Commonwealth as a whole. However, the rapid growth we have experienced in the last 8 years has presented significant transportation challenges. The most practical approach to solving these problems is to improve and expand the Seaport's transit network. This study presents an opportunity to build a transit network that will meet the needs of today's commuters who want more service and better reliability, and will help mitigate future traffic as the Seaport continues to grow. A careful study of how transit improvements on Summer Street, Congress Street, the Northern Avenue Bridge, and how they'll improve mobility in the district will be a critical aspect of this study. I'd also like to reflect the point of view that the private shuttles that operate in the South Boston waterfront serve a very valuable purpose. They provide thousands of trips every day to commuters going to their jobs who otherwise would not have those last mile connections due to lack of service from the important points that those shuttles serve. Seaport TMA looks forward to working with the city and other stakeholders on these issues as part of the larger public process. And we thank you for your attention to this matter.
Thank you very much, Patrick. All right, now, sorry, Chief Osgood. I think that was actually really helpful to frame some of the questions that councilors would have had anyway. So again, if you could back up a little and please proceed.
Absolutely. It actually underscores, to your point, sort of even more value of just giving that this sort of quick synopsis, because I think there's a value in us all being here to talk about all the progress that is actually going on and the timelines and sort of the budgets and things like that. So again, and it has been referenced, we are making a lot of progress in this area. I think we're making a lot of progress in this area because we have this foundational plan from 2015, because we actually have a great coordination between MassDOT, the MCCA, Massport, the neighborhood community, as Councillor Flynn referenced in the 4-Point Neighborhood Association, the business community like A Better City, the Seaport TMA, Seaport Leadership Group, as well as the City of Boston. And in addition to having that plan and having that coordination, there's also funding which has been made available both through the bond bill, the city's budget, investments by Massport, the MCCA, et cetera. Just in sort of to capture some broad things before turning it over to Jim to talk specifically about transit, for those of you who are getting around the Seaport, getting to the Seaport by walking, we've made a significant number of investments in that area. The sidewalks along places like Summer and Seaport and Northern and Sleeper, sections of those have been substantially rebuilt. The public realm has been significantly improved because of some great collaboration from some folks in the room, in particular by Pat Hoey. We have a whole set of wayfinding signs throughout the district now to encourage better walking, better use of sort of people getting around by foot, either to or through the district, knowing that is sort of the way we can best animate the streets and least congest the roads. For those folks who are interested in biking, there's been a tremendous number of work which has been going on some of the key east-west corridors. So on Seaport Boulevard, we now have parking protected bike lanes running through much of the new Seaport Square section. As folks know, underway right now, we are reconstructing Summer Street from 4-Point Channel to West Service Road, adding cycle tracks on both those sections, and the mayor's put additional funding in to do planning for the next section of Summer Street to go from West Service Road to the Reserve Channel. On Cypher Street, as MassDOT's been leading, there is designs for a cycle track on that stretch as well, again, to provide good, safe cycling facilities, to Councillor Flynn's point, to be able to get to or through the South Boston waterfront. As Tony had pointed out, there is a tremendous need to be moving people into and out of the South Boston waterfront by transit. That is the focus of what Jim is going to present on. But one major part of that is a series of investments by the MBTA, who have been adding additional capacity and support for those key bus routes of the 7 and the 9, including the reconstruction of the City Point Terminal. There is shortly in 2019, there will be a new connection for every commuter from the north to the South Boston waterfront, and that is going to be a new water shuttle that's going to go from Lovejoy Wharf to the South Boston waterfront. In addition to that, there's been a lot of work by Patrick Sullivan and the MCCA around shuttle consolidation so that mass transit option is more coordinated and more consolidated on our roads. In addition to all those, there's a lot of focus, and a lot of this has been led by Massport, to really improve freight connections into and out of the South Boston waterfront, recognizing how important that is as an economic driver for the region as a whole, and that includes the opening of the Tommy Butler Bypass Road and the work that we are all doing to improve that Cypher Street, that Hall Road, Cypher Street, East Street connection. And then just across the board, there's been work by a number of folks in this room to simply improve the street grid in this area and to make the signals, to uplift all the signals in this area and make them work better for everybody and be safer for everybody, no matter how you're getting around. That is a work which is largely happening between MassDOT and the Boston Transportation Department to bring the next generation of traffic signal technology to our streets and also provide some new ways of getting people into the district through things like opening up the Hall Road for general traffic at specific times. So that is sort of in broad strokes, whether you're walking or you're biking, you're moving people, you're moving freight. There's a tremendous amount of work which is going on and investment which is happening. We know that there is much more to do. And it's for that reason why we're particularly excited about the transit study, which Jim's going to lead, so I'm going to turn it over to him, and then we're happy to take your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, councilors. My presentation has since gone dark, but I can get started.
Carrie will take care of us. Let's just wait a second so we can all follow along.
Okay. Okay, great.
Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you, councilors. Again, I'm Jim Fitzgerald. I'm a senior transportation planner with the BPDA. And I think this hearing is very timely because this effort has yet to really get started. I think Councilor Flaherty referenced that we did go to the board back in June to get permission to issue an RFP to hire a consultant team with resources that we have since acquired through the Seaport Square project to allow us to really advance this work. So really the focus of this effort is really going to be on transit. You know, obviously we've got exceptional growth in this neighborhood, and frankly, I think the transit isn't keeping up. You know, we want to look at especially public transit. Silver Line obviously is a key service for us in this neighborhood. The water shuttle, the water ferry that the chief mentioned is going to get started in mid-January. So how do we take advantage and leverage that and improve connections to the water ferry? And then the shuttle issue, how do we continue to consolidate those shuttles, make them more public, and get them to be more efficient so that they're not creating more problems on a traffic standpoint than they're providing as far as connectivity. So we want to coordinate all these ongoing efforts, some of which were mentioned, that I'll mention a little bit more here. The MBTA and Massport is just getting started on what's called the Silver Line Capacity Study, taking a very thorough look at the Silver Line, the future of the Silver Line, and how we can get the most capacity out of the Silver Line in the future and going forward, and what improvements need to be made to the Silver Line. So we want to coordinate with that effort. Also, what has been mentioned and was a strong recommendation in the South Boston Waterfront Transportation Plan is the North Station to Seaport sort of rapid bus idea, whether that's Congress Street, whether there's a different routing for that. We want to really get into the weeds on that and sort out the best routing for that, figure out what sort of infrastructure needs need to be provided to allow that connectivity to get, or that idea to get off the ground. I mentioned the water ferry as well. The chief mentioned Summer Street Phase 2, which is going to get started in earnest, and this sort of analysis and this effort will help inform the future of Summer Street. What are the transit accommodations we want to do for Summer Street and its future reconstruction? We want to look at things like, does bus rapid transit lanes make sense for Summer Street? Certainly, I think we want to improve the stop conditions, the efficiency of the operations of the 7 on Summer Street, and then obviously the Northern Avenue Bridge, which is currently ongoing with its ongoing process. If that decision allows for a connection, how do we utilize that as well? We want to analyze that, see the benefits of that opportunity. And I think it's really a key time with MBTA too, because as I think most folks know, they have their ongoing Better Bus project, which is going to look at the entire bus network and look at recommendations for making service improvements, route changes. How do we want to make route changes in the Seaport and connecting areas to improve mobility in the Seaport? And then there's obviously a lot of sort of previous recommendations that have been referenced, especially the ones that come out of the South Boston Waterfront Transportation Plan. We're going to use that and Go Boston as our jumping off point to evaluate some of these sort of longer, bigger ideas. Things that have been proposed by private entities like the Summer Street Cableway, Track 61. How do we get, what could be the benefits of utilizing that? How do we utilize Track 61? And then other bigger Silver Line capacity improvements like T under D and some other big projects that have been out there. We want to really get into the weeds on those and analyze those and see which package of improvements really make the most sense on the transit side. Obviously, this will be a very collaborative process, working with the City Council, with all the other agencies that we've been working with over the years, and there will be a very robust community process to solicit feedback, input, to get reactions on some of these ideas and this analysis that we're going to be conducting with this study. I mentioned some of the recent planning efforts, and building off of those efforts, the South Boston Waterfront Transportation Plan, obviously, Go Boston 2030, has some specific Seaport recommendations which mirror the South Boston Waterfront Transportation Plan. Again, the sort of connectivity to North Station, I think, is key. The Track 61 is a recommendation in there as well, and how do we utilize that, not just in the Seaport, but how can we connect it to a larger network? What are the potentials for that? Summer Street, we want to continue protected bike accommodations for the entire length of Summer Street. How does that coordinate with transit improvements that we're going to be looking at? And then obviously Vision Zero is a key part of all of our work, making sure that safety is paramount, access to transit and the safety of access to transit, access to buses, bus stops. And obviously we have our complete street guidelines that give us some pretty good design guidance on how to advance access to transit, bus stops, how do we design those, will be a key component to this. Right now we have proposed a focus area that is obviously on the Seaport, but I think we also want to expand it certainly at least down to First Street, where we know there's a lot of additional development pressure and land use changes. We also want to include Broadway Station and South Station for those obviously key connectivity nodes, and how do we connect to those the best way possible. But it's really not just about within the Seaport, it's about connecting the surrounding main destination corridors or neighborhoods within the city. Obviously the South Boston neighborhood is going to be key. How do we improve connectivity, and not just additional connectivity, but speed of connectivity, I think, will be key as far as transit is concerned. As far as the existing buses, how do we improve their operations and both capacity and operating efficiencies? Obviously downtown is a key connection, the North Station, which I mentioned, and then Back Bay kind of connectivity, South End. Those connections have always been pretty difficult to get to the Seaport via transit, so how do we make improvements to that connections into those neighborhoods? So a brief outline of the scope of work that we are finalizing right now, that will be the scope of work that the consultant team will do, that we will look to hire with these resources. We want to first obviously spend a little bit of time developing the necessary tools to analyze our recommendations and the ideas that we generate with the community. Obviously have a period where we're identifying not just issues, but then what are the principles and goals, working with the community and all the stakeholders within the Seaport. And then we just want to develop, in addition, build off those existing recommendations, but then look at new recommendations and be very specific about these recommendations. Are there bus routes that need to change their routing? Are there additional bus routes we want to try to pursue? Obviously, the levels of service are going to be key, and how do we recommend, through this analysis, additional service and where that service should be added. And then working with the community to get feedback and on these ideas and sort of narrowing down to really making some sort of recommendations that are really solid, that there's a lot of overlapping ideas, a lot of sometimes competing ideas for the transit network, but I think we want to really make some hard decisions on which ones make the most sense, which ones are the most benefit, which ones have the most community support, and come up with basically an action plan that will allow us to, backed by a lot of analysis, backed by very specific recommendations, and backed by how do we implement these things, I think will be the key sort of end product of the action plan. Timeline, which we've mentioned a little bit. You know, we did get these resources through the Seaport Square re-permitting, the notice of project change that they went through. We received these funds just this month, and that will allow us then to issue this RFP for the consultant services to allow us to get this project started in earnest, hopefully by January of next year. We need a little bit of time to issue the RFP, give time for consultants to respond, and then get the consultant on board, a little bit of sort of background analysis work, and develop these tools to really test all of the different ideas that we're going to generate with the community. And we're going to look, while this process is going on, we're going to look for some obvious immediate improvements that we can try to make, whether they be within our streets, infrastructure changes, you know, ways to better utilize our existing infrastructure. I think we're going to look to pursue those during the study, so we don't have to wait until the study is completely done. And again, as the councilors have mentioned, we have put in there a 9-month time frame. I think hopefully it won't take that long. I'm hoping that we can really hit the ground running in January and get out early spring and start really getting the ideas going and hopefully get into some immediate action steps that we can do before that 9-month timeframe is out. So that's the latest timeline and latest overview of the types of things that we want to look at with this project.
Thank you very much, Jim. Commissioner Pat, would you like to add anything? Great. Then we'll go to questions from councilors, starting with Councillor Ed Flynn.
Thank you, Councilor Wu. My first question is, could you give us a little bit of background information? Maybe I have to ask Mass DOT, but what the status of the Silver Line Phase 3 is?
Go ahead, I'm sorry, Jim. Phase 3, do you mean the connection between the Washington corridor and Seaport, the tunnel connection? I know that had gotten through some design and was through a process, and I think right now it went through some FTA review, but to my knowledge, it hasn't been favorably scored by FTA. So right now, it's still sort of in the concept stages. It's something that I think we would like to see, but.
Are you receiving any comments from residents expressing their interest in getting Phase 3 up and running?
I haven't specifically, but it was something that we evaluated in the South Boston Waterfront Transportation Plan, and we did recommend continuing to try to advance that project through that plan, and I think it was well received by the community. Obviously, there's a big cost factor to building the tunnel connection, at least as the previous iteration of the project envisioned. So,
Would it be beneficial to the city to have Phase 3 up and running?
Absolutely, I think it would be. But again, there's, I think, some significant cost and infrastructure hurdles to building the tunnel under Essex Street. This is going back when it was the active sort of design process that the MBTA was engaged in. You know, I think there was some opposition from butters, of course. But I think the sort of end result of that process was that the costs versus the benefits, as viewed by FTA, were not that high enough for, I think, continuing to advance that project in earnest. But I do think it's something that we think would be a great benefit.
I see a lot of development taking place in and around the area, possibly the Edison redeveloped, the hotel across BCEC, a major project going up near the Federal Reserve Bank, near Salt Station. What impact will all of this have on parking? Will it have on traffic? Are you preparing right now for those buildings coming online, but more importantly, during the construction phase, what is your plan to deal with traffic while one is built, or two is built, and the third one is built, or maybe even all at the same time? Are we able to effectively move cars in and around those two neighborhoods during the construction phase?
In terms of the Omni Hotel, they'll make use of the existing parking garage that was constructed by Massport to serve their needs at the hotel. 776 Summer, they've proposed a substantial parking garage, I believe over 1,300 spaces, which there's debate whether the wisdom of that, whether it's too much, too little, but they have proposed that garage as part of their project. In terms of construction, all projects of this nature have to submit a construction management plan that has to be reviewed and approved by BTD Engineering before they can occupy the roadway. So there's a permitting process to help us manage some of the concerns that you mentioned about, you know, taking travel lanes during rush hour, things like that, putting out barrier, restricting the roadway. So through the permitting process and the construction management plans, BTD, Public Works, that type of oversight to get us through the disruption. But good question, fair question. And the parking, again, Omni will make use of the existing structure. 776 has proposed a 1,300 space garage.
So you would think that the traffic would be minimal during the construction phases?
I'm sure there'll be disruptions during construction with the Omni right on Summer Street, which is already constrained during peak time. So it's fair to say that there may be, some delays related to construction as we have in a number of these projects. But between the police and BTD enforcement and others, our eyes on the ground with our cameras to monitor the construction, we should get through it.
What is the relationship between BPDA and BTD when a project is in the very beginning stages and traffic has to be part of the conversation? What type of relationship are you having with BPDA, with the residents, with the developer? And what is your main focus as part of our BTD?
Council, there's always close coordination with the BPDA. They engage with BTD very early on in the process so that we can come to some sort of assessment in terms of what the potential impacts could be to the community. Any construction phase certainly goes through a phased approach where, our perspective is that public safety is always our #1 priority, and ensuring that we're clear with the contractor in terms of what the expectations are with their construction management plans and their traffic management plans. We know that early on in the process, a lot of equipment is brought in for staging, and then impacts are sometimes fluctuate throughout the course of the project. BPDA has engaged us very early on in all of the major projects throughout the city. We work very closely.
For every project, is there a traffic plan that's also presented in great detail on what impact it will have to the impacting neighborhood?
I can answer that. Yeah. Yes, Councilor. Every large project, every project over 50,000 square feet that is submitted through the BPDA for review is required to have a transportation access plan incorporated in the project notification form. It contains information on existing conditions, projections, build conditions in terms of increased trips for vehicles, transit, pedestrians. All that has to go through review by BPDA staff, BTD staff. We work with the developers, transportation teams to make sure that the methodology was correct that they used in terms of forecasting what the impacts would be to the city streets. And then considering all that, what we do is we look to offset those impacts through mitigation, whether it's requiring a developer to contribute to retiming an existing signal, or constructing a new signal, or creating a bike lane, things like that, to offset whatever their impacts might be. So to answer your question, yes, through the Article 80 process, each project, large projects, are required to have a transportation plan in their submittal for review and comment, and ultimately, approval through the approval process and permitting.
I was talking to some residents at the Wharf District Council several nights ago, and one of the residents asked me if I could relay to you, is there a possibility to get a comprehensive traffic study for the Northern Avenue Bridge as it relates to, pedestrians, vehicles, vans, who's eligible to use it, who's not? Is there a public document that you could share with us that could help residents in that area?
So the person over my left shoulder is the person who's actually been putting that information together from the AECOM team. Some of that information has been already provided, both at the public meeting we had on Wednesday night, the previous task force meetings we've had over the course of this year. It does sound, though, both from that question, knowing that the Wharf District Council is part of the task force, and from, I think, a comment that Tony had made, that there may be a way that we need to sort of package and present that is just sort of clearer and more accessible, and so we can work on doing that.
Okay, yeah, that'd be helpful. I did promise a couple constituents that I would try to work with you to get such a report. So it would be important for me to follow through on that. What is your biggest challenge with all this construction going on in the city? How are we going to get people into downtown? How can we get people into Fort Point, into the South Boston waterfront? What is your plan?
It's a great question. So within the South Boston waterfront specifically, we obviously do have the South Boston Waterfront Sustainable Transportation Plan, and that is being essentially sort of updated or sort of advanced through the work that Jim is leading, looking at transit in general. Across the board, as we think about all of our big objectives, managing growth, increasing equity, creating a more resilient city, we need more people taking active or shared modes. That means better transit, whether that's at the local level, things like buses, or particularly for the South Boston waterfront, a much more robust commuter rail system is something which is incredibly important, and to have a lot more short trips made by walking and biking. As you said in your opening statement, Councillor, we're not going to get more folks to feel comfortable walking or biking for trips if they don't feel safe. So a tremendous amount of work which we're collectively doing is improving the safety of our roads by making infrastructure changes to them. And then a significant part of our work going forward is our coordination with the MBTA to really make our streets work better for things like buses and mass transit, and over the long term, really increasing the capacity of our overall regional rail system. The state has already made some significant investments in this regard, so the investments in improved red line service going from basically 4.5-minute headways to 3-minute headways by the early 2020s will have a significant benefit for this region. The future rail vision work that the T is leading right now is something which I encourage everyone here to be involved in, because I think that has a huge impact on how well we can move people throughout the region to destinations like South Boston, South Boston waterfront, the Wharf District, et cetera. These are some of the big pieces that we're working on to make sure that those key pillars of more active transportation and more shared transportation actually move forward in the way in which we collectively envision.
And my last final question is, during these conversations, could we also include ways where we can reduce the speed in our neighborhoods, whether it's in Fort Point, whether it's in Seaport, throughout South Boston? People going down A Street or B Street, West Broadway going 25 miles an hour, going to the Fort Point area, 25 miles an hour is too fast. Can we come up with a plan that will reduce the speed? I know I've spoken to almost all of you about it, but I'm very concerned about cars speeding through the Seaport, Fort Point, South Boston, over 25 miles an hour, probably 40 miles an hour. But it would be a combination of reducing the speed and a combination of enforcement. I was down at Fort Point over the weekend with my wife at church, and there was some elderly people there. Weren't able to cross the street because the cars were going 40, 50 miles an hour. Can we do something about the speed in Boston?
So, Councillor, we've worked so closely with your neighborhood in particular on reducing speeds. As you know, it's a challenge, and we see this really as a three-pronged approach, and the first being some engineering interventions, and some of which we've made in South Boston in terms of reducing crossing distances and improving sight lines, installation of raised speed tables at some of the intersections. Clearly, enforcement is a key component of the success of any engineering interventions. We've closely coordinated with BPD. We've installed speed radar boards that provide feedback to motorists in terms of the speed that they are traveling. But education is also a key component here. Clearly, folks are using roadways in ways that they really were not designed for, with navigational apps, as well as the distraction that those apps provide. So we definitely want to work with the community. We want to identify how we can partner with our law enforcement agencies and some of our advocacy groups to really highlight the imperative of folks putting their phones down and slowing down.
Just to add to that, Councilor, I mean, I think a key component, as I mentioned, of this transit study effort will not just be service and where it should go, but access to service and safety for pedestrians to access transit. So I think that fits in. And as I mentioned, if there's some very key areas where we want to do some sort of tactical urbanism interventions like we've done through Vision Zero, I think we want to look at that very quickly and try to get some of those interventions in place even during the study.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Flynn. Councillor Flaherty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jim, if I could just tighten up the schedule. So it's, just so that I'm clear, it's in, so the RFP will go out in January of 2019. The RFP will be out in the street for 30, 60, 90 days. What's the perimeter on how long that'll be out in the street?
I'm hoping that we can get it out before the end of the year.
Okay.
The RFP advertised.
So potentially end of December 18 or January 19?
Yeah.
And then when it's out in the street, we're going to give folks how long to?
30 to 45 days.
30 to 45 days. So some type of announcement, maybe sort of early, mid-February-ish,
Yes.
somewhere in there?
Yes.
And then the clock would start for the 9 months shortly thereafter.
Right.
Kind of brings us up to
Correct.
probably around kind of this time next year, all right, ish.
I think we'll do everything we can to expedite that time
Okay.
frame.
Just want to be tight on it.
It's right.
And then had been BPDA reps had mentioned that it was only going to focus on bus rapid transits, but I see from your presentation that it's going to include obviously Track 61, which I think we're huge supporters of. One thing we have concerns on, and I know the chief and I have had the discussion about this, is that we're South Boston elected officials, we're not sold on this bus rapid transit idea. Particularly Congressman Lynch is insisting, and I talked to the chief about this, is including an aerial, take an aerial look at or an aerial solution as part of this RFP. And I'll be supporting that effort as well. So if there's a takeaway from here that we'd like to include in the RFP, that whoever, I guess, bids on this study, that while looking at bus rapid transit, and just for the record, taking a lane of travel in each direction on Summer Street is a non-starter for the South Boston community, a non-starter. So unless you want to try to find a way to put bus rapid transit in there, we're keeping those lanes open, which, given the the extensive work that's gone down there to date, I know that we'll fight you tooth and nail on it, and I know the congressman is adamant and is a big supporter of at least taking a look at aerial, particularly the gondola concept. And I think it's important that we start to look at some more forward thinking and some more innovative solutions. Same old's not cutting the mustard. Our bones aren't that big, as I've mentioned before. Our street grids, our infrastructure, now may be the time to sort of think a little bit outside the box, and we would be insisting that that be in part of the plan. As well as the proposed focus area, I think it's incumbent upon the study to take a look at several things. Take a look at opening up the Dorchester Ave extension that runs down by South Station, South Postal, to run it up D Street to Old Colony Ave itself, D Street to Old Colony, and also L Street. Those are the main cut-throughs. So a lot of that traffic that's, I guess one would argue it's not really originating there. They're coming from areas north, south, and west, but they're cutting through the South Boston community to get down to the waterfront. And I think that we'd be doing a study, and we had a very similar study working with Massport Authority as well as the MCC, ABCC about expanding that footprint. So I know that you have the proposed area and you have it sort of charted in here, but there's some pretty main thoroughfares that I know that we've been working closely with the commissioner and the chief and Pat over the course of the summer. Again, they're extensions of I-93. People come off of I-93 and they haul up L Street, they haul up Old Colony Ave, they haul up Dorchester Ave, Dorchester Street, and I just think that that needs to be included in the study area as well. And then diving into sort of the the funds, if you will. So I know there was a total of 400 that was set aside. And in that memo, it was a November 16th, 2017 memo from the BPDA that discussed it. They talked about $400,000 being the funds, that the funding shall be allocated to initiatives to be determined in coordination with the BPDA and other public agencies. Such initiatives may include the following: Silver Line capacity study, following completion of the above study, funding towards Silver Line system improvements. So I guess the question is the Silver Line capacity study being considered as part of this South Boston strategic plan, and is that included in the $400,000?
That is not part of this $400,000. That's a parallel effort, as I mentioned, with MBTA and Massport that they are leading.
Okay.
So that has their own funding, and we expect to work very closely with those, that analysis and those results and those recommendations will be coordinated with this effort.
Okay, are those funds currently there, or are those?
Those funds, they have their funds secured to do that effort, correct? And it is not within the $400,000. It also is not from any of the other Seaport Square mitigation.
Okay.
You may have noticed in the board memo for Seaport Square, they also are providing operating subsidies for a 10-year period for the Silver Line for $250,000 a year for a 10-year period. So they're also, helping to fund operations of the Silver Line and hopefully additional improvements to the Silver Line.
Okay. And that says, in the same memo, matching funds are also mentioned to assist with the South Boston Seaport district-wide study of potential bus route improvements and/or bus rapid transit corridors. Is that coming out of the $400,000, or is that?
Yeah, I think those two kind of bullet items will be part of this effort. The reason why we said, potentially matching funds would also be added to it is we weren't sure if all three of those pieces of work could be funded with the $400,000, but we've been fortunate that, with Massport and the MBTA, that they were able to find resources to fund the Silver Line piece. So I think we're confident that those other two pieces can be part of this effort.
I know we have some of the representatives there, so I didn't know whether or not we were planning to utilize sort of the state capital funds that were included in the fiscal year 17-21 to the Mass DOT capital investment to fund projects as part of the South Boston Strategic Transportation Plan.
I would hope that could be an option, absolutely. Okay. And then on some of the other things, that, hopefully I don't forget some of your other questions, but I think the study areas definitely could be changed and expanded as necessary based on your feedback and others from the community once we get up and running. I think absolutely the connection of Ave to Summer Street, I think, is something we've always wanted, and we realize there's great benefits there. I think some early planning, thought about bringing better bus access via that corridor to get to South Station. I think that could be a big improvement to help decongest Dewey Square and Summer Street specifically. So that will also be part of it, and all the potential benefits of that connection for transit access, I think, will also be part of this effort. I don't know.
And we would support those. And again, I think we're at a critical point in terms of if we need additional funding or additional matching grants, et cetera, given that we're hearing from commercial brokers that there are folks that are in the process of renewing their leases, and they're either deciding to maybe kind of pull out of that area just because it's tough to get in and out, and/or more often than not, more of their employees are asking to work from home, so they're actually going to be requiring less square footage, and I think that's a serious issue that we need to get our hands around, and opening up these conduits. The Dorchester Ave extension is a perfect release valve to make that happen, but to also take a look at the impacts that it's having sort of in the broader community as it's being cut through to get down there, in addition to being able to move the flow down there. They're all related to one another. So, so we'd love to obviously see that, and if we have to expand, I guess the ask for those to step up and to partner with us, then we need to know that if we have to set some other funds aside, probably now is the time to know before we head into the budget season. And then obviously just try to get a commitment on making sure that an aerial solution or an outside of the box forward-thinking idea is thrown in, as opposed to just lumping it into the bus rapid transit movement. And I know that we have other folks that we're going to hear from as well today to kind of find out a little bit about kind of what they're doing. If we're talking about the MCCA, BCEC, talking about their expansion, Massport obviously as they continue to expand their cruise ship terminal activity as well as Conley Terminal, and there's some talk about potentially trying to open up that Cypher Street extension, which would require these trucks to basically make a left-hand turn across Summer Street. Not on board with that. There's got to be a better alternative, I think, to that. We know, I think we've talked to you guys all personally, while I'm stuck bumper to bumper on L going to Summer, and to envision these big tractor trailers and chassis making a left-hand turn across Summer Street. That's no bueno. That is no bueno. That's just going to be, that's just a recipe for disaster. So we need to work closely with Massport to try to identify what the solutions to those issues are, because once those super tankers come in, we're going to see that truck flow at a minimum triple, possibly quadruple. And again, a good news, bad news, it means the port's active, the port's engaged, people are shipping here, we're putting lots of folks to work, all good stuff, but to be able to get that freight in and out and to address these conflict points with other vehicular traffic, with pedestrians, with cyclists, I think more work needs to be done on that, and I think that if there's at least a collaborative effort and there's a partnership and there's a sharing of information so that we're not operating in silos, the work that Rick is doing with all the stakeholders down there, the work that folks at 4 Point Channel have been advocating for, BPDA, BTD, Massport, BCEC, and it's a collaborative effort if we can continue to keep those lines of communication open as we're doing these surveys and studies. And then just lastly, I guess through the chair to the gentleman that's in ACOM, and we talked about it, Chief, you mentioned that we were at one of the Northern Avenue Bridge Task Force meetings, and I challenged the sort of the survey that had been taking place. And if you think about, if you're in a vehicle and you're down, say, near the federal courthouse, and you're trying to exit South Boston Waterfront, and you're going to naturally take the left because you can't go over the Northern Avenue Bridge as it currently is configured. So most folks would take the left, and so if we're surveying vehicles at that juncture there, I had suggested, I think the study is flawed from its inception, because unless you knock on the driver's window and you ask them what would their preferred route of travel be, and they would say, well, no, geez, if Northern Avenue Bridge was open, I'd just go over the Northern Avenue Bridge. But that's not always going to be the case. So all those cars that are queued up bumper to bumper there, you cannot assume that they're going to go over the Northern Avenue Bridge, because the chute, in order to go I-93 north, you have to go over the Evelyn-Oakley Bridge. And so unless we have our clicker and we're sitting there and we're clicking cars, and if everyone thinks that those cars are going to be attributed to Northern Avenue Bridge, I think that's from the get-go, that's a flawed study. You literally would have to knock on the door and ask the driver and or his or her occupants as to, I guess, where's your final destination? So if your final destination is, the North End or Charlestown, or you're going over to Mass General Hospital, that's a Northern Avenue Bridge car. If you're going up to Reading or Woburn or Danvers, that's an Evelyn-Oakley Bridge car, you know what I mean? Because when you come over the bridge, you have to get in to get onto to 93 North. So I just throw it out to ACOM as you're sort of listening here, that I'm not quite sure what type of study is going to give you an accurate accounting of vehicles that would choose Northern Avenue Bridge over the Evelyn-Oakley Bridge or over Congress Street or another street. So I throw me a little editorial on that we have to kind of figure out how to get that answer. And then one final thing is if anyone has a solution, someone mentioned blocking the box. I think it might have been Richard's question in the opening from public testimony. And I know that there's some technology that may be coming online. Has any of that addressed the blocking of the box? Is there any technology out there that we could use that would curtail folks that block the box, other than having an officer knock on the window and pull the vehicle over and give them a citation? Because they can't be everywhere, but when you see the block the box, it's one of our major issues, and I just don't know if there's any technology. And I know there's maybe some new technology coming on that we're going to try fairly soon. I just don't know if it addresses block the box. If it does, great. If it doesn't, or if you know something, I think we should go procure it, because it's a big factor here.
So in short, the work that we've done and the work we've been focused on are those things which we have the current authority to do. So that really is about signage and striping, as well as stationing officers in a particular area for deterrence. The use of technology, things like photo enforcement, are things that are not actually currently allowed by the state as a means to actually issue a ticket, whether it's for blocking the box or for other sort of enforcement issues.
Councilor, thank you for your comments. One way on the Northern Avenue Bridge piece that you mentioned and trying to determine the volume that would use it if it was open, if you count the right turns at Moakley and Atlantic Ave, those that don't access the tunnel, because there's no other way to go. So that number, the number of vehicles turning right onto Atlantic Avenue from Moakley, you could surmise would be the number that would use Northern Avenue, extracting what was coming from Seaport Boulevard. So the number of sleeper.
Count them at the Hook Lobster site as opposed to down near the Federal Quarter site.
Or at Atlantic, if you counted the rights, which we have
Yep.
data for, the right turns at Moakley and Atlantic, not going into the tunnel, proceeding on Atlantic Avenue, and then separating out those that were on
Going to the
Seaport,
chute.
right? You could determine the volume in a general fashion
Gotcha.
that on Northern Avenue, that's already on Northern Avenue, coming from Fan Pier or 100 Northern Avenue or wherever, Pier 4, that number potentially would use a westbound barrel of the Northern Avenue Bridge.
It'd be more accurate than if you were
Yeah.
counting on the other side of the
Right.
bridge.
And not an exact
That's fair.
science, but,
But gives you a fairer representation of it.
right, if they're turning right on Atlantic and they're not accessing the tunnel, then it's fair to say they might have gone over the Northern Avenue Bridge and turned right onto
Right.
Atlantic Avenue. Just local traffic,
Right.
not necessarily interstate traffic. So that could be local, locally, regional. So there is some merit to that, but the debate continues.
Yeah, and then there's some that may abandon it and go straight up Sleeper Street to Congress Street, you know, kind of snake around and go in and around. That's probably more of a Back Bay, Beacon Hill, sort of a West End traveler maybe, instead of going over and snaking that way, I guess. But
And
it
to the
would be-
commissioner's point about the apps, GPS,
Ways and all that
that
stuff.
can definitely be a factor, and who uses what connection over the channel.
True. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Flaherty. Councillor Sabi George?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the makers for this. I have a couple of quick questions. One on the TNCs that came up during public testimony. Do we know the current utilization of those TNCs?
Within the South Boston waterfront or the
Yeah.
city in general?
Well, I mean, I guess in general, I'm curious, but specifically on the waterfront.
In general, as come up before, at least in 2017, there was roughly 96,000 TNC trips that started in the city of Boston every single day. About 34 million in total over the course of the calendar year. We don't, at least we don't have with us right now, I think, the specifics of how many originated in South Boston waterfront or particular areas of the South Boston waterfront. I do think that as a huge focus for us is figuring out how do you actually have pickup and drop-offs, whether it's TNC, taxi, or anything else, actually work effectively in some of these key corridors in the city, and that's some work that BTD is working on.
And do we have an idea of the utilization of those, of the buses in particular, especially on the waterfront? Are they at full capacity? Are they 25% full, 50, 75?
So we have data both on the number 4 as well as there's data on some of the shuttle services that are provided as well. My sense is, and others may know better, that there's capacity on the floor and that the shuttles are very well utilized. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think the 4 has some available capacity. The number 7, I think, is, as everyone knows.
Those are MBTA buses.
Correct.
Yeah, oh, sorry,
What
correct.
about the private shuttles that operate in the Seaport?
As far as available capacity, I think we're going to want to really figure out, how much capacity we can get out of those and what's remaining. So, yeah, I think that will be part of this effort to try to figure out how to make those more efficient and serve more people.
What is the fee that they pay to use our roads?
A Hackney fee? Is there a Hackney?
On the shuttles in particular, on the vans?
I think that obviously, as was raised and it's raised question, there's mass transit, which is sort of a broad category, which includes both the shuttles and sort of public transit like the MBTA. Neither the T nor, and correct me if I'm wrong, sort of there's not a specific sort of user fee for the use of the road for either of those categories.
I'm curious, about any sort of revenue opportunity. But then my second question is, relative to the TNCs, why we can't ask them to allow the public to utilize available seats once their employees or, whoever's using them occupy those extra seats. Because we're, if they're not at full utilization, especially in the off-peak hours, they're still operating, they're still idling, they're still, using our infrastructure. Could they also take our residents and visitors from point A to point B?
Just to slightly differentiate between sort of TNCs, which are typically thought of as sort of like Uber or Lyft, sort of your ride.
I'm sorry, I mean the
Got it.
shuttles.
Yes, no, totally. And so that is, as Jim referenced, I think there's an opportunity for us to think about how the shuttle system, which is, I think, a very important way we move lots and lots of people sort of by higher capacity vehicle than driving alone, how we can actually make that system work best for everybody to I think, the collective interest of all of us here.
There's a lot of those
Council-
shuttles down there.
I'm sorry, to your point about the shuttles and the capacity, the consolidated shuttle, and maybe Pat at TMA could correct me, but I believe they're serving over 4,000 people a day right now, maybe close to 5,000 on the consolidated shuttle. Would like more companies to participate to reduce the number that are out there on the roadway. But that's 4,000 or 5,000 less single occupancy vehicles. So there is a value to the consolidated shuttle.
I don't disagree that there's a value, but if there's also an open seat, I'd like to see if there's ways that we can access those seats, or residents or visitors or employees that don't have direct access to those shuttles can utilize those
Excellent point.
seats.
Thank you.
My other question is on, some of the recommendations that we want to make to the MBTA. Who are you working with to deliver those recommendations? Because, I think especially my colleagues from South Boston, there's been recommendations for as long as I've been alive on improvements that we've never been able to see the light of day.
So there are two very significant MBTA planning processes that are happening right now. One is called Focus 40, which sort of looks at the overall system, subway, bus, and to a lesser degree commuter rail that T is going through. So the Focus 40 sort of draft recommendations are actually out right now, and we've been very active in giving feedback on that. I encourage everybody else to do that as well. There's a very specific commuter rail effort called the Future Rail Vision that's happening, which I think has some specific impacts on this area. And that is another planning effort that we've been very engaged in, giving some specific feedback about things we think could make a much bigger difference for this area, for the city, and frankly, the region as a whole.
And to add to that, Councilor, the MBTA's Better Bus Project, which is underway in earnest now, is really taking the comprehensive look at the entire bus network and making recommendations for route adjustments or improvements to the existing network. And we have been working at a staff level on a very regular basis with the MBTA service planning folks who are leading that effort, and they're going to work with us very closely, obviously, on this effort. And we think these recommendations will help, inform and reinforce sort of the recommendations that they're going to come out of that Better Bus Project.
I think we need to just also find ways to leverage the $83 million that we pay to the T for the benefit of them riding our streets, which I still sort of don't understand. I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Sabi George. So just to follow up on a couple of things of the really great questions of my colleagues. On the private shuttles, and this will be, I think the next panel will be able to answer some of this as well, but the city has a jitney license, which this committee also oversees, which I was trying to pull up the language. The state law says that no person, firm, or corporation shall in the city of Boston operate any motor vehicle upon any public way for the carriage of passengers for hire, similar to a railway company, et cetera, without obtaining a license from the city council. And that's the ability for the city to freeze, or at least have a sense, each license must include the number of passengers they intend to carry, the size of the vehicles, the schedules and the routes, so that it's, one, not reduplicating transit, and two, not causing public safety issues. So my understanding is that none of the private shuttles in the Seaport area have these jitney licenses. I could be wrong, but would love to follow up on that at some point. And just to, offer that this committee should have some oversight or at least role in thinking about those conversations. I also want to connect it back to the question that Tony had brought up earlier from Livable Streets about what is defined as transit, and what, whether it's the Northern Avenue Bridge conversation or this larger study. how is the city and or BPDA thinking about private shuttles versus mass transit? And I've heard them kind of lumped together in statement after statement. How are you thinking about that distinction as in terms of priority and use of the roads?
Thank you, Councillor. So to your last point, I think the priority of this focus is really going to be on public transit, publicly accessible transit. I think we probably will get into, how to better route and manage shuttles. I think will be parts of those recommendations. But I think first and foremost, the focus will be on publicly accessible transit services.
Do you intend to have any dedicated lanes or BRT sort of improvements available to not just the MBTA buses, but also the shuttles?
I think we need to see whether or not, from a capacity standpoint, that would make sense if we do, with this effort, think about some potential sort of bus priority interventions, whether or not those are just T or just shuttles. I think those are things we need to discuss and determine, if there's extra capacity for them as well, and it makes sense and it helps improve overall traffic. I think we could consider that, but we haven't really made that decision yet.
I think that extra capacity or the availability, given your considerations, should only come with some commitments to really function more like mass transit.
Yep.
Whether it's opening it up, any extra seats are automatically opened up to the public. I mean, I hear from residents that's sort of de facto happening, and no one's asking for your employee ID upon when you board, and all the residents know what all the routes are of which shuttles. But to formalize that, so people who aren't in the know or just visitors to the area have that available, and also to subject them to the same signage requirements, the same other commitments that mass transit has, to allow the benefit to the corporations and the businesses. I think is great because there are so many employees, and certainly there's such an economic hub of the city there. But there's I think there's room to push it even further in terms of access, and so that would be a strong demand coming from this committee. And I'll talk to the next panel about that as well. I think, Jim, you were the one who mentioned that the study area could be changed as you're going through the geographic area.
Right.
So could you explain a little bit about what does that mean? So Councillor Flaherty walked us through the kind of January to February to potentially November, December timeline of the study, but at what point will the geographic boundaries be locked down within that?
I think we want to work with the community and confirm sort of what our focus area will be. So I think that will happen early on. Obviously, we need to get started on focusing of our work, but I think it's more than just kind of the study area. It's connections outside, obviously, that are way more, or extremely important to address. So those connections and improvements to improving those connections beyond the study area are obviously kind of paramount. But I think the intent of kind of a study area, and I don't know that we'll ever really lock it down, are to say, these are the areas that we're going to look to, maybe adjust routings, look to ways to sort of improve operations for transit, was kind of meant kind of more, I guess I should call it a focus area. But it's not like we're not going to look at the impacts of the sort of service recommendations beyond those borders, because really we're trying to serve, not just Seaport mobility needs, but getting to and from the Seaport from these sort of key other sort of destinations throughout the city. Obviously, the South Boston neighborhood, North Station, as we know, we struggle with that connection, downtown, et cetera. So
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful distinction, that it's not as if the boundaries will mean that you're sort of putting on blinders for everything else. I guess my question is just about the phasing of it, and if you're saying that you're realistically trying to finish this by spring, even though the 9 months goes further than that, but the first part is sort of an open-ended, well, we're not even sure exactly what area we're talking about or what we're talking about, and then once we define that, then we will zoom in and do likelihood of BRT or aerial or anything else. I just want a little more detail on sort of what percentage of the time will be, let's call it phase one of defining the study, and then phase two, the actual study within the 9 months or February to spring. How does that break down?
I'm hoping that we can get clarity within the first month of really actively kicking off the study on kind of the focus area, and then where are the major connections we need to sort of solve for. I think needs to come very quickly, to your point, in order to really get down into the weeds on starting to develop recommendations and improvement ideas. So I'm hopeful that can happen within the first month, I guess, of the effort, just confirming. And I think Councilor Flaherty brings up some good other sort of areas beyond sort of this hard line here, but I think we should be able to hopefully determine that pretty quickly, and that obviously needs to be done quickly so that we can focus on what we want to try to make recommendations for.
So I guess my ask there would be if at least when the study is, even if it's at the latest when the consultant is chosen and they kick it off, if there could be clarity about the end point of phase one,
Right.
because I just anticipate the community not understanding that, or rightly so, being confused about the fact that if they want to weigh in on this part, they need to get to the first meeting in the first month. Otherwise, there's no opportunity, and then it will be sort of zoomed in. Whereas it might appear from the beginning that we're conducting this multi-month process, and you can weigh in anytime on any of these issues. But if we know your feedback on this will only be taken and then quickly implemented in month one, you have to come to the first meeting. That should be clear for at least the neighborhood leaders to be able to tell everyone else.
Okay, great, thank you.
And then, let's see, in terms of the phase two then of that study, I'm particularly curious about the BRT analysis, bus rapid transit. What level of detail are you intending for the result to encapsulate? Will it be, we suggest these routes and here's how we would deal with any concerns around traffic and making congestion worse or removing parking, et cetera? Or is it just going to be a fairly general
I think it's definitely the former. I think we've had a lot of the general, here's,
Yeah.
a great idea of connecting via Congress Street to North Station via some sort of BRT types of interventions. But we want to see what happens if you try to design those interventions and then analyze with traffic modeling to see, if you want to put a queue jump in at an intersection for a bus, how does that impact general traffic? Or how maybe it benefits it. But so that's really the type of work we really want to get into the weeds on. And be kind of specific about choosing corridors, stretches of roadways where we think, these transit improvements really make sense. And making sure that we're not, by doing that to improve transit, we're not creating, obviously, further traffic congestion. So that will be kind of the core of our work.
And that essentially by the end of with the recommendations in hand, it would really just be implementation and
Correct.
policy sign-off.
Correct, and I think we're hoping to get also to sort of some conceptual costs for the package of improvements, trying to be, realistic on the timing of them, which ones can happen, hopefully sooner. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm hoping that we could find some immediate interventions, especially when it comes to things like safety and access to transit, through sort of some tactical urbanism type interventions that we could try to do right away, and then maybe those lead into sort of more, harder construction, especially when Summer Street gets reconstructed. Can those sort of tactical urbanist ideas become real, sort of hard, if you will, curb line changes, those sorts of things will help inform the Summer Street Phase 2, for example. And I think we've done some design work on Congress Street, for example. I think we need to look at that, revisit that, see what sort of, it's kind of old design, I would say, done a while ago. I think we need to revisit that and figure out, for example, Congress Street. So sort of all the main corridors we're going to look at, sort of conceptual improvements, design improvements, especially as they relate to transit, but also access to transit, ped safety, those sorts of elements.
Okay. And you said that this will dovetail with the Silver Line capacity study. What's the timeline on that? When is that set to conclude?
Well, I know that they've started to do the background sort of analysis with that. I'm not sure of I know Hayes is here. If you have determined how long that will take, or as far as that analysis, not to put you on the spot, but.
Okay, great. So just for folks watching, the response was 3 months and done in the new year.
Right.
So in time to be incorporated into.
Absolutely,
Yes.
yes. That's that was the idea I was trying to articulate earlier, is that sort of that's going to be a very technical piece, looking at, how do we maximize the Silver Line operations? How do we make improvements to get the most out of Silver Line? That will help feed into sort of our sort of bigger vision for transit improvements. Will be, fed into this and coordinated with this effort.
Okay. And finally, for me, What's the transportation planning capacity in-house for the city and the BRA?
I think we rely on multiple agencies, BPDA planning.
How many planners are there that are transportation focused?
There are 4 of us now. So our deputy director is Tad Reed. He's the deputy director of transportation infrastructure planning. I work with him, and then we have 2 additional staff that are transportation planners, Matt Moran, who's sitting back there, and Nick Schmidt, who we just hired. So right now there's 4 of us that work on specifically transportation planning. But then obviously BTD planning has a very robust staff and always has. And I've been fortunate to be at the BPDA for the past 14 years. At one point it was just me. So I think the ability for us to add staff, I think, has helped the city as a whole. And we work constantly daily with BTD planning and their staff. And as you know, they're growing as well. So I think.
Yeah, Chief and Commissioner, could you just outline, I know there are some posted positions even now, but at what point will there be X number of people specifically thinking about transportation planning?
We're in the process of hiring a transportation team right now. Interviews are ongoing, and we're nearing completion of the first phase of those within the planning division. So we anticipate having at least some staff on board before the end of the year. So that will certainly fortify the planning division. Under Vineet Gupta, Pat Hoey is our senior planner assigned to this particular region, and we'll work closely with Jim Fitzgerald and the BPDA senior staff.
So is there anyone right now that's focused just on transportation planning, or?
You mean transit planning?
Yes.
Sorry.
I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm really not sure what the difference is.
Under Vineet Gupta, he does have a series of transportation planners that are dedicated to all things related to transportation, specifically as it relates to transit. We've had folks that are on the Better Bus working group, and Vineet Gupta has taken the lead on that. Pat Hoey has also taken the lead on the Rosendale bus lane on Washington Street, as you know, and will oversee and coordinate with our new transit planner. There'll also be operational staff that will be dedicated to BTD, as you know, to actually implementing these things, as well as engineering staff that can consult with the engineering side of the house to actually design transportation and transit improvements with the MBTA.
Okay, so I feel like this is a kindergarten question in this room of experts. So when you say transit planners, you mean people working and interacting with MBTA?
Correct.
But what about bikes and multimodal as well?
Mm-hmm.
And then transportation planning, you mean just streets, signals, or what's the distinction?
So sort of all things related to transportation, that's basically our mission. In the active transportation division under Stephanie Seskin, there are planners that are dedicated to the sort of micro-mobility and new mobility. We're in the process of hiring staff for that as well that will work on TNCs and sort of better curb management. All of those things we think there's be a certain cross-pollination of functions as folks work together to see how we can work better with the MBTA as well as with our other partner agencies.
So, for example, by, let's say, April 2019, how many people in BTD will be are planners who are working on either MBTA-related things, bicycle routes and infrastructure, or signalization?
We can probably get you a better organizational chart as it relates to specific functions and sort of get you some clarity around exactly what personnel resources will be dedicated to different mobility functions, as well as on the operational and the engineering side, so that we can actually implement what we identify as some of the important transit and mobility improvements.
Okay, that would be very, very helpful.
Okay.
I'm not trying to belabor a point. I guess I'm trying to wrap my mind around this is such a need across the city in every neighborhood. Are we intending to grow these numbers, or will it always be RFP, look for funding to fund a consultant, more timelines, deadlines, et cetera, or when can we start absorbing more and more of this in-house?
And correct me where I'm off on this. So within our policy and planning team within the Boston Transportation Department, there are 5 planners who basically take a geographic focus. And that is sort of the role that Pat and others play, all working for Vineet. There are these groups that we are building out to be able to do much of what you're saying, to go faster on things like transit, which is the transit team. So we're adding 2 folks who basically will be planners or planner engineers who are focused on transit. There are 2 additional folks who will be added to Stephanie Seskin's team, which was not included in that 5. This is already getting more complex. You're right. An org chart would probably be easier, but 2 additional folks on the Vision Zero side, and then 2 additional folks on the TDM and sort of new mobility side, transportation demand management and new mobility side. So in many ways, we are actually doubling our capacity over the course of, on the planning side alone, to be able to go faster in this particular area. Again, this is because, as you said, you know, the mayor recognized there's a need to be able to go faster and do the work that we all want to be able to get done. So your collective support of raising the parking fines, which essentially indirectly supports our ability to expand our capacity, has been incredible.
And advocacy for resident parking permit charges. I'm going to keep that out there. And then Jim, so you're 4. You're 4. Is that projected to grow in the near term?
No, I think we've been fortunate to add to double kind of our staff.
Okay.
Just in the past year, year plus, I should say. And again, you know, we work daily, hourly with BTD planning. So I think it's great. I think we're a very collaborative team with BTD planning and the rest of BTD engineering as well.
Okay.
Councilor,
Yes, Pat.
we've never had a dedicated transit planner. It's been a shared responsibility. So having 2 transit planners dedicated to transit full-time will make a huge difference and help expand our capacity to do more.
Okay. Great.
This is basically, you know, we're keeping things on schedule in terms of the recruitment and the hiring. So on July 1st, when the positions were actually formalized and approved in our budget, an individual in the Public Works side of the House and Chief's Cabinet has been assigned to actually crafting the job descriptions and working through the administrative process to have positions posted and organizing a recruitment effort for us. So to bring on board roughly 20 people has been a task that there's been a whole team within BTD as well as within Public Works and the Streets Cabinet that have been dedicated to this. So, you know, we
Will
really
they be
want
all
to make
on,
sure.
do you think, by February-ish?
We anticipate a fair number of them.
Okay.
Yeah. There's
Great.
been a great response, so the postings are out there.
Okay, well, we'll expect a list of their phone numbers as soon as they're on. Do my colleagues have any other questions? Okay. Oh, Councillor Flynn.
Thank you, Councilor Wu. I had one comment as it relates to the South Boston Waterfront in Ford Point. You know, are we also thinking about a comprehensive evacuation plan if there was some type of an emergency there, factoring in the gridlock or factoring in the traffic? And having said that, my long-term plan is I'd love to see a firehouse or a police station in that area. I think it's very important to start thinking about this now. Any thoughts about that? Or
So the city's Office of Emergency Management sort of coordinates that globally. At regular intervals, the Boston Transportation Department and the Boston Police Department sit and review evacuation routes for the city of Boston, so that there's sort of regular coordination on that.
the reason I brought that up, I served 25 years in the Navy, and I worked on some of those issues. But it's also important for us to communicate with the residents in the impacted areas about what their responsibilities are if there was some type of an evacuation as well. What should they expect? How do we communicate with them? You know, just questions that we always need to keep asking, keep updating our plan, and maybe we can continue talking about this at another time, Chief.
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, panel. We so appreciate your time today and all you're doing. And as we do the switch over to the next panel, I would like to invite down Rick Domino from A Better City. Hayes, if you would be interested, Hayes Morrison, if we would love to have you join us, and Tommy Butler, Mark O'Leary from the MCCA, and Andy Paul from MassDOT. In the meantime, there was no one else signed up for public testimony. If anyone wishes to, okay, if anyone wants to speak, I'll take up to 3 members of the public right now before the next panel starts.
My name's Dan Keshin. I live in Seaport. I've been a resident of Boston for a long time. And the plans we heard about just now are great. We're really supportive of the long-term plans and all the rest of that. The one thing I have to say is in the Seaport area, in Fort Point, we need some policemen. We need traffic. We need just presence. It makes such a huge difference when we can walk down the street and see a policeman. That's not a year, multi-year plan, but it's something that would solve a huge number of problems. Cars parked in the bike lanes, double, sometimes triple parked outside the Benjamin and the Via. It's just so congested that a couple of neighborhood cops would make a tremendous difference. So I'm begging you to find a way to do that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Dan, thank you for that comment.
Yep.
I do talk to Captain Boyle almost every day. I'll reiterate that to Captain Boyle that maybe we can take another look at adding more police presence down there. I agree with you, and Michael Flaherty will also talk to the police commissioner about it as well.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's a short-term solution, I know, but it would really help us. So
Yeah,
thanks again.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Richard, do you have a second comment? I do. Okay, before you, was anyone else interested before I go to second rounds from anyone? Okay, please.
Sorry, I apologize.
No, we
Didn't
won't.
realize how this was going to flow. So I'd actually like to just address the private shuttles for a minute and really clear up a lot of misconceptions. First of all...
Would you like to just join this panel then?
No, thank you.
okay,
It'll just
all
take me 2 seconds.
Probably smart.
No, I just want everyone to have the right information. Thank you. But really, I think the key component of this is the private businesses addressed a need in the neighborhood that was not available through public means. There is no public transportation that's adequate from that area to North Station. So the private groups decided to get together, and several of them had their own shuttles that they were operating with or without. I don't know about the whole license side that was brought up. But I think it's important to note that they addressed a concern and are trying very hard to assist in alleviating the congestion in the neighborhood and removing vehicles from the streets. So that's number one. It's 100% privately funded. There's been discussion about public component of that. The only public component of this is that actually the private businesses are actually paying and working with the MCCA to provide the staff to oversee it and run the RFP for the buses. With reference to having the public ride, we would love that to happen. We would love to have some city support. Those businesses pay tens of millions in taxes and would love to have those buses be paid for by the city, not by the private businesses. As we go to the ferry program, which we have been a huge advocate again, get the buses off the street. It's 13 minutes by water to get from North Station to the Seaport. We are developing with the MCCA an application to provide public seating when there's availability at a cost, which is hopefully going to be the same cost that the private businesses have, so that it will be open to as many people as possible, as many available seats, particularly on a reverse commute when those will probably be empty at a reduced cost. But they have to be at some kind of cost to help us offset what we are paying, which is in excess of $3 million. So I just want to be clear that that is going on, and we think it's great for the city. We hope the water ferry is going to be an example set for the city that can be done, but we really look forward to getting some public assistance to let everyone ride them. We'd love to have everyone on them, but I don't think you can continue to ask the private businesses to pay millions in taxes, but also underwrite private programs to try to get people from point A to point B. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk again.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Sarah, would you like to speak?
Just a quick comment. My name is Sarah McCammond. I live at 15 Channel Center Street in the Four Point neighborhood. I'm also involved in the Four Point Neighborhood Association, and I'd like to first thank Madam Chair, our councilors, Councillor Flaherty and Councillor Flynn, for understanding how important this issue is to us, and I think it was said well in terms of our quality of life. Just wanted to touch briefly upon the fact that there's been some incredible planning efforts that have already occurred, and I'd be very interested in knowing where we are in the implementation of the South Boston Waterfront Sustainable Transportation Plan, how those initiatives are going to be implemented in tandem with the Seaport Strategic Transit Plan, and then also mention the coordination between the state agencies in the city and the community is extremely important. And recently, MassDOT came out to the community about, for example, the Cypher Street Improvements Project. And one of the questions the community has is, why is, with the anticipated increased truck traffic from Conley Terminal, why is the suggestion to bypass the bypass road with trucks? So there's definitely some interest in understanding as we work together on Track 61 and a lot of great initiatives that are in the neighborhood, how the community can be involved and how the city and the state can coordinate these plans and these efforts to improve our transportation needs. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to hearing more from this panel.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so thank you, panelists, for your not even agreeing ahead of time to come, but now being dragged to the council floor. The suggestion from Councillor Flaherty was that we know that you all are here because you're involved very intimately with different parts of this whole conversation. If you could maybe just go down the line, or maybe Rick could start out and give the overview, and then if each person after that could also just chime in a few sentences about your agency's particular involvement, that would be extremely helpful for us.
So first, Councilor Wu, Councilor Flynn, Councilor Flaherty, thank you so much for inviting A Better City to be part of these conversations and deliberations. We constantly excited and look forward to collaborating with the Boston City Council. All of you have been tremendously engaged with shaping the city and helping all of us try to move the city forward. And there's a number of instances where we've been able to collaborate to get some pretty wonderful things done, and we greatly appreciate that. And again, thanks for the invite. Going back to, A Better City, first I better start with, my name is Richard Domino. I'm the president and CEO of A Better City, and A Better City is a business association that has 130 members in Boston and the urban core in the region. My membership represents a number of the major economic drivers in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and we are directly focused on working and collaborating with the City of Boston, other cities, and the Commonwealth and the region on shaping and influencing the built environment to keep ourselves economically competitive, help to support our quality of life, as well as to work on matters of sustainability and climate change. We try to do that as effectively as we can. We've been in that business, believe it or not, since 1989, when we were the Artery Business Committee, and still remain actively involved with these types of projects. So in 2014, A Better City was asked to chair and to help project manage the South Boston Sustainable Transportation Plan, and we did that with the collaboration of all of the relevant city and state agencies. $1 million was raised, and another $100,000 was raised by the private sector to put forward and go forward with that plan. That plan was initiated by the Menino administration and then was further supported and advanced by the Walsh administration. Many of you were part of that. Many of you helped to make sure that we were doing that right. We engaged many, many members of the community. The public engagement process was very robust. All of the city councils that, from the areas and local legislative officials were actively involved in helping us to think through that plan and make sure that we did it to the best of our ability. As was discussed here earlier, there was a number of near-term, mid-term, long-term recommendations that were identified in that plan. I have, and I'm ready to share with you a update on a number of the recommendations that were related to that plan, and I'll hand that to you when the appropriate time comes. But some of the interesting findings of that plan that are really important for us to continue to be reminded of was we looked at what the implications were going to be relative to the growth of the Seaport by 2035. That was one of the things that we really wanted to try to get our arms around. And interestingly enough, and we finished the plan in 2015. So 3 years have since passed. But in 2015, we estimated by 2035 that there would be another 17 million square feet of development in the South Boston waterfront area. That could be as many as 9,200 additional residents and 23,000 additional jobs. And you should know that in 2013, we finished this plan in 2015, so we could only take a snapshot of the relevant data that we had at the time. In 2013, there were 36,500 jobs already existing in the South Boston waterfront. So the notion of adding another 23,000 and also another 9,200 residents was a pretty significant finding. In addition, when we looked at those numbers, we thought we should better understand what the trip relationship was going to be relative to that growth. And that study found that there would be a 63% increase in the trips to this area by 2035. 64% of that increase in the number of trips wanted to be on public transit. So your questions about where is the future of public transit heading are completely relevant and very important for all of us, including me, to work with you to try to answer. It's a critical element of the future mobility of this area, but also the relevant relationship to dealing with issues of congestion and safety that relate to the immediate residential areas.
If I may just interject through the chair. So how does that square with the recent survey that just came that T ridership is down? So
Well,
you have a 63% increase by 2035. You have a significant portion of that saying it's going to be public transportation, and then there was a study that just came out within the week saying that T ridership is down.
That's right, Councillor. And there was some specific routes, like, for example, the Blue Line, where there was actually increased transit.
Yep.
I'm not sure, and I would need to look closely at the Silver Line, but the one thing that we understood and actually analyzed and examined in our study was the Silver Line, which is the transit service, the specific part of the Silver Line that connects South Station to the South Boston waterfront, is over capacity. So at the AM peak, 125% capacity of the Silver Line was identified in the study. And from all of our relevant qualitative input, that line is still over capacity today. So the most robust of the transit services, and there are bus services that go from the South Boston community into the Seaport as well as then go on into the downtown, the Silver Line is already at over capacity. And as you well know, even though generally speaking, overall transit numbers are down, the relationship to transit to this particular area is frankly over capacity. And I know you know this because you share your concerns with me together with Councillor Flynn, Councillor Wu, and the rest of you on a regular basis, that bus service is inadequate, that we currently have sometimes buses passing by residents that can't get on the bus because they're overly crowded. Of all the buses that serve the area, only the 4 bus has some capacity. That's the bus that happens to go to North Station because the routing and configuration and the travel time of that bus is very, very inadequate. So the transit demand for this area is currently very high and is going to get stronger. And the transit service that's currently in the area is inadequate. A Better City then worked with our city and state colleagues in Massport and with DOT and the City of Boston, of course. And again, I want to credit all of them because they showed great leadership and they're continually focused on the implementation of this plan and work collaboratively to implement this plan. But one of the recommendations that came out of this plan was to tell me and our colleagues at the Seaport TMA and to work with the public sector to consolidate the private shuttle operations. That was actually a clear recommendation because, as Richard Martini referred to, there was There still remains a number of independent shuttle operations that are not part of that consolidation, but by and large, we've consolidated most of those operations. And as a result, are being much more efficient, utilizing that shuttle system in a very efficient and effective way, actually carrying more people and connecting. And again, I want to emphasize, the people that are on those buses are the public. Those are citizens of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that are ultimately deciding to take rail to North Station or the Orange Line to North Station and then get on a private shuttle bus that wasn't being provided by anybody else. We would be happy to see the public sector and the MBTA pick up these people. We knocked on that door and nobody answered. So in order to accommodate those trips, the private sector actually worked with the convention center, and that idea was actually a good idea because the convention center only of the public agencies were in a position to and had the capacity to manage transit to the level and the relationship that we were looking forward to having it done. And so basically combining our efforts and resources with the public agency that actually had transit management and planning and operational capacity made a huge amount of sense. And those public taxpayers of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that are preferring transit are getting supported relative to their transit trip to the South Boston Waterfront. And I think it's a very important share of the modal split. Another important fact relative to the kind of generals, the transit capacity or mode split for the South Boston Waterfront is horribly smaller than what it's supposed to be. When I got to be a public official many years ago, we thought the transit share in the South Boston Waterfront was going to be 45% of the trips. When we did the study, it was 31% of the trips. We had projects, as Councillor Flynn suggested earlier, that the Silver Line Phase 3 project was going to help us get to that 45%. We had many more vehicles than are currently operating on the Silver Line in the queue to be purchased that still aren't even purchased today. We had T under D that was supposed to be making the Silver Line better, listed as one of the plans and still listed in the Waterfront Transportation Plan and recommendations. So we still have a ways to go to get to that transit share number. And it's clear that the numbers that are being forecasted relative to the trips and the growth of this area are going to need to have transit if we're going to be successful to support the mobility of this area going forward. One last point. The relationship to the transit operation actually did end up with some recommendations and then some actions. And again, I have this list for you. For example, the public transport buses that are actually going from South Boston to the Seaport were directly improved. We actually saw an increase in the headways and the frequencies of that public transportation service. And that was in the partnership with the MBTA. Together with the City of Boston, all of your help and the legislators, we got the $25 million passed for the capital improvements for the South Boston Transportation Plan in relationship to getting those things recommended. Those dollars are allocated, and I can tell you specifically on how they're allocated. In addition, we got $103 million allocated by the MBTA last year for new Silver Line vehicles, again, through all of your advocacy and the work of the collaboration of the public agencies. There are many good things going on relative to the implementation of the plan, but there's still much more work to do, and I look forward to being partners with you to get those things implemented. Thank you.
Thank you. Hayes, maybe from the Massport perspective, and then we'll just go right on down, or whomever
I guess
wants to jump in.
if I may, I think to paint the clear picture, I think Andy and MassDOT maybe in context going first.
Yeah, sure. I can provide maybe some supplemental information to what was presented by Chief Osgood earlier. MassDOT's role in this, the two assets that MassDOT owns in the Seaport area are 93 and I-90, so you might be asking why is MassDOT here at the table. But what we do provide is an avenue for state and federal funds to support transportation projects of many different shapes, sizes, and modes. One of those is the Cypher Street project, which provides a freight connection from the Conley Terminal to the bypass road that's currently under design It was a public hearing, and we heard some folks speak about that. We are looking to do a more robust public hearing as this project unfolds and engage neighborhood stakeholders through that process. In addition to that, other action items that came out of the Sustainable Transportation Plan were to look into the bypass road. So MassDOT has opened up the bypass road through a permit process with the Executive Office of Environmental Affairs to allow vehicular traffic, and we're monitoring that and will be over the course of the next 10 months. In addition to that, the state, through the Department of Conservation and Recreation, does own Day Boulevard. It was identified in the plan, and a road safety audit was conducted in February of this year. There was obviously the tragedy that struck over the summer that accelerated the implementation of a road dye on Day Boulevard and improved safety access to and from the neighborhood to the beach. That work is ongoing. We're also going to be doing improvements at the corner of L and Day Boulevard to the signalized intersection that's currently under flash control. The bond authorization in 2016 as an extension of the plan is something that we also are overseeing through the support of the Baker-Polito administration, and would echo Rick's comments that those funds are spoken for, but I would say, Councillor, that if there are things that come out of BPDA's transit study, I do work very closely with our district offices throughout the state when projects are initiated to identify funding with our Office of Transportation Planning. So if there's real actionable items that qualify for state or federal funds, it's certainly something that in our partnership with BPDA and BTD could initiate a project to identify funds and take action on implementing those. We also have the Adaptive Signal Control Project, which MassDOT is helping oversee in partnership with BTD. That's along Summer Street and should help improve transit signal priority through that corridor. It is first of its kind in Boston, but MassDOT has done adaptive signal control on other corridors throughout the state, and that's currently going through an RFP process right now. There's also been other items which were mentioned by the chief, that the Summer Street work was a pass-through of that $25 million directly to the city in funding for those resources. There were a couple of other questions, but I think I'll let my other colleagues speak and we can continue the discussion.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark O'Leary, and I am the Communication and External Relations Assistant Manager at the Convention Center Authority. I also serve as the liaison for the Convention Center to the City of Boston. I just want to thank Chairperson Wu, Councillor Flaherty, and Councillor Flynn for having this meeting today and inviting us to testify. The MCCA has worked with members of this committee on a variety of issues. Transportation has been a consideration always with the MCCA, but has become a priority over the past few years. The MCCA knows that transportation woes in the area are a main issue. We also know and understand that we have a responsibility to minimize and mitigate the daily impacts of our operations at the BCEC to the neighborhoods south of our campus, South Boston. We just want to, take this moment to say that the primary focus of our transportation department that was founded in 2007 is to move people in and out of not only the BCEC, but the Hines property that we own as well. We bus people, hundreds of thousands of people every year to and from these convention centers, and we're well aware of the frustration that our convention center guests have, many of whom travel thousands of miles only to find themselves, gridlocked a couple blocks away. So transportation is expensive. We know that. It's frustrating for our guests, and it's expensive for our show managers. But we understand that our transportation problems are a part of a larger problem for South Boston. And when you sit down and you start to contribute to making improvements in South Boston transit, that provides tangible benefits to not only the BCEC, but all stakeholders involved. So that's why the MCCA has consistently looked over opportunities and are contributing to making improvements in the South Boston area as part of the South Boston Sustainable Waterfront Transportation Plan. For example, over the past couple of years, The MCCA has, as you've heard, grown and operated a bus consolidation program, working with private partners in the area. We've taken what was once over 20 separate privately operated shuttles and now turn that into 12 buses who can perform a more reliable and consistent service for the people in the area. And so with the success of that program, we're happy to announce that we're going to be taking that onto the water now. In January, in the first quarter of next year, we're going to be launching the first public-private partnered ferry service running from Lovejoy Wharf behind North Station to Fan Pier in the Seaport. So there's going to be an opportunity for public ridership, as mentioned, on that, and we'll be taking additional buses off the road with the long-term goal of reducing more of these shuttles. So last summer, the MCCA also collaborated with many of the stakeholders in this room today on a wayfinding initiative for pedestrians, where a lot of stakeholders contributed, and we were able to put up 70 signs on wayfinding that allowed pedestrians in the area to be able to easily and more efficiently navigate what has become, Boston's newest neighborhood. As mentioned, the MCCA also owns Cipher Street, and we are in full support with many city and state agencies on making Cipher Street a complete street. Cipher Street is already being accessed by members of the neighborhood, and because of that, we feel that making for a multimodal street accessible through crosswalks, bike paths, signals will provide the protection that's not there right now for the pedestrians accessing that street, and we feel that's a priority. These improvements, as well as the sidewalks on Summer Street that have just been are almost near completion, have made a significant impact on the area and have really improved the commute from South Station to the BCEC. So we appreciate that. And I would just say that in closing, the MCCA supports really an all of the above approach to any of these programs that we're talking about today. We look forward to continuing to input where we can, contribute where we can, and to really work with all the stakeholders involved in making the waterfront more accessible, but also more safe. And if I could just wear a different hat at the moment, on a personal note, as a lifelong resident of South Boston, I've been able to see not only the growth in the waterfront, but the growth in the neighborhood. I've also seen the growth of congestion and safety issues grow with that development, which raises concern. When you talk about change in our neighborhood, mobility and safety need to be a priority. And I just want to applaud this committee for taking strong leadership on that and being at the forefront of these issues. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Wu, Councilors Flaherty and Flynn. My name's Tommy Butler, and I'm the Assistant Director of Massport's Office of Government Affairs and Community Relations. And with me, I'm joined by Hayes Morrison, the Deputy Director of Strategic Planning at Massport. We appreciate the opportunity to come before the committee, and we appreciate the collaboration we've enjoyed with the City of Boston in the past, and will continue to enjoy that in the future on issues facing the South Boston waterfront. The Massachusetts Port Authority operates a number of maritime facilities throughout the South Boston waterfront. Conley Terminal is the only full-service container terminal in New England, and we service 8 of the world's 10 largest shipping lines. So in FY18 was another successful year at Conley with roughly 284,000 TEUs coming through the terminal. And with the success of the Port of Boston, we've been required to partner with our federal and state partners to continue to invest in the port. And some of those investments are through 2 new berths at Conley Terminal and a large dredging project that has been undertaken. And these are to ensure that Boston remain a viable option nationally in this industry. Flynn Cruise Port, Boston has also enjoyed a very successful 2018 season with roughly 390,600 passengers visited the Port of Boston this year. This included 152 ship calls from 33 different vessels, which represent about 20 different international cruise lines. And with the success of Flynn Cruise Port, we've also, are working with state partners to look at some potential investments that need to be made in the cruise port as well to keep Boston viable in that industry. Also at the Fish Pier, which Massport also owns and operates, we've enjoyed full occupancy at the Fish Pier with our tenants from the seafood industry. So that industry is vibrant and alive and well. So to subsidize many of these industries, we have about 400 acres of land, which include a mix of commercial and residential developments that financially help subsidize Maritime's mission, but also serve as public realm and open space throughout the South Boston waterfront. So as part of, to ensure that these, the maritime mission thrives in the South Boston waterfront, we, with our collaborative partners on the transportation plan, we're able to construct and open the Thomas J. Butler Freight Corridor, which was a significant investment that allowed Massport to not only improve operations at Colony Terminal, but also provide a quality of life change for the residents of First Street in South Boston to get those trucks off of First Street and get them on the corridor to get them out of the neighborhood. The South Boston Waterfront Transportation Center serves as a multimodal transportation hub that, we think filled a void in the waterfront in, providing not only just parking, but also, there's bike accommodations, there is, information about public transit, and just is a nice mobility hub in the area. Silver Line bus acquisitions, the South Boston waterfront wayfinding signage that others have referred to was a collaborative partnership that we've seen success down in the area. Collaboration with MassDOT on Cypher to E Street, 25% design, and then also the South Boston Bypass Road pilot program, which we look forward to getting some results from. So with that said, we enjoyed these partnerships in the past, and we look forward to working with not only the council, the city of Boston, and our partners at the table to improve transportation needs in the South Boston waterfront.
Thank you, Tommy. Hayes, would you like to add anything? Okay. Questions from Councillor Flynn?
Yeah, thank you to the panelists for being here and for your update on what you're working on. It's very helpful and appreciative. I have a few questions, and Mark, I enjoyed listening to your presentation about some of the great improvements the convention center is making, especially around pedestrian safety. I know some of the blinking lights and the pushed out sidewalks on Summer Street is a direct result of BCEC, make it an easier commute to walk from South Station to the convention center. What was the feedback from some of the visitors that came to the convention center as it relates to the commute from South Station to the convention center, walking?
Well, as you know, it's still ongoing, the improvements on Summer Street from the last mile there, as we call it. Not only for convention guests, but we are also able to hear some feedback from members of the community through our private shuttle systems. As you know, we work a lot with the private partners in and around the area, some of our neighboring employers. The feedback has been positive. Street improvements on Summer Street have always been a goal. Just tackling those and figuring out the right timing for that. We commend, we applaud the efforts from the city on that. Those sidewalks were always tough. So I can say that, from guests traveling from Summer Street into the convention center and from employers around our property, the feedback has been positive. People are very appreciative of that.
Thank you. And I know on Cipher Street, I do have the opportunity to speak to Fort Point residents frequently, at least once a week. Maybe we can have a discussion sometime over the next several months, but I'd really like to bring in some more environmental professionals, take a look at Cipher Street. How can we make it more environmentally friendly? I know there's a lot of chemicals below the street that needs to be addressed. So that would be PCP and how we can make improvements to the Cipher Street. The residents of Fort Point are looking forward to working closely with the city and the state and with the convention center to try to deal with that issue. For Tom Butler, I also want to say thank you for the cooperation Massport has given to the residents of Boston, not only in South Boston, but in other neighborhoods as well, in East Boston. And, the Port of Boston is strong, it's vibrant. As a matter of fact, there's a U.S. Navy ship that's getting christened tomorrow, USS Thomas Hudner, named after a Medal of Honor recipient from Massachusetts. So it's such a great honor for our state to host it. But the reason the Navy is coming to Boston is because Massport is prepared to welcome them, and the city of Boston is doing great to welcome our ships into the harbor as well. So thank you to Massport. And Rick, I just want to end with, I think you're providing strong leadership on working closely with the city of Boston, working closely with the state transportation officials. We do have a major, as you know, a major problem in the Seaport, and I'm mostly concerned about it as a public safety issue. I'm nervous if there is an emergency, if there is a fire. Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock. That's why I would really like to see a police station there and a fire station there, but also an evacuation plan and how we communicate effectively to the residents that are currently living there. I don't know, can you comment on some of those points, Rick?
Sure. Excellent question, Councillor Flynn. Earlier comments were made about the relationship to enforcement and the relationship to intersection control. And I think the focus of those types of things is something that warrant a good amount of attention and priority. I think the opportunity to think about how both the neighborhood and the South Boston waterfront relate to the regular deployment of the appropriate public safety personnel and enforcement officials, and how we could potentially work to see a more focused resource of those types of human resources in that area would be something that I think I know that all of you are interested in, and I think that warrant some additional attention. I do think that at one point, the city council and the city considered cadets in a different role. I was fortunate enough to be the commissioner when that opportunity presented itself. I think it might be worthwhile to have those conversations and examine those opportunities again. I think the opportunity to, again, I know that all of you are deliberate over the City of Boston's various departments' budgets. I know it's kind of sometimes challenging to think about increases in the budget for parking enforcement officers, but I do think that sometimes it's a good idea, because I think it's in a way to actually help the city do its job to keep its streets safe. And all of you know that relative to my position on that, I feel pretty strongly about it. And so I think as, you know, the Transportation Commissioner and the Chief have those types of resources, the opportunity to target them and to focus both police, cadet, parking enforcement personnel in areas where they're needed on a more regular basis, as opposed to being spread in many different jurisdictions and geography, would be a good idea, and something that you know would benefit. Some of these areas, obviously, where the growth is pretty substantial, the traffic volume is substantial. The relationship to the impact on residential streets as well as streets within the business districts are pretty significant. So that kind of thinking, which I know that you are all engaged in, and if there's ways in which we can help, we're happy to help roll up our sleeves in that regard. But your interest in that regard is absolutely right on the money and makes a lot of sense. And, you know, we have great working partners here at Massport and the Convention Center and DOT and the City of Boston. And so this question of enforcement and police and public safety personnel, you know, there's also jurisdictional questions in this area. And leadership, I believe, from elected officials is necessary in that regard. And legislative action. And you know, we applaud you for considering helping to solve those problems, because we think that they're important. They don't only affect the day-to-day life of the public, but they also relate directly to opportunities to help solve this problem. So we stand ready to be part of those conversations. You know, we don't get involved with directly in those types of things, but we do think it's important to try to solve them. And again, if there's ways for us to be helpful, you please let me know. But your point was well made, Councillor, and I didn't want to go on too long, but I just wanted to answer some of the
Thank you. Thank you, Rick. And I guess my final question or comment is to the gentleman from the DOT. It may be unrelated to the topic right now, but DOT has a piece of property. It's called the Reggie Wong Center. It's a basketball court, a volleyball court off of Chinatown. It may or may not be up for sale at some time, but I can tell you that it's utilized all the time by young people playing volleyball and playing basketball. It's the only park in Chinatown, outdoor park, and it's a tremendous asset to the people of Chinatown, and I'd like it to stay that way. And when I do get the opportunity to talk to DOT people, I do like to mention that that is an excellent park, and I think it should stay a park.
It's our intention to have it remain a park.
That's what I like to hear.
Thank you, Councillor Flynn. Councillor Flaherty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Andy, thanks for mentioning the road diet stuff. Just to give an opportunity to give a mention to Senator Collins and State Representative David Beal. They did a lot of heavy lifting on that, working with DOT and obviously Congressman Lynch as well, and Councilor Flynn for the speed humps there that just came up, obviously, for the anticipated inclement weather, but seems to be paying off some dividends there on kind of slowing down the chaos on Day Boulevard as it enters L Street and heads out towards Castle Island. So appreciate you mentioning that. And obviously, Rick and everyone here, we see each other pretty regularly. I see you so much so I'm thinking you're running for the open city council seat, you know? But
no, I like my lot in life as it currently stands.
I'm sure you do. But if you think about the first panel we had and the second panel, at the end of the day, for me, the takeaway, and again, we see each other lots of times, whether it's, you know, Tommy and Massport, we were on the Hudner the other day, dealing with folks down at the Convention Center. There's a whole myriad of issues that we deal with, so we're out on the circuit. But I just want to make sure that the takeaway here is if we're not collaborating, we continue to collaborate. I mean, you think about, as long as you're staying in touch with sort of Chief Osgood and Commissioner Fiandaca and Pat Hoey and Jim Fitzgerald at that level, you're doing what you're doing with all the stakeholders down there, Massport, BCEC, DOT, everyone has consultants. So as long as they're all talking to one another, I just want to make sure that we're not operating. And I know that at times there's competing interests, and there may be some disagreement, but I really think that we're at a critical time for our city. Again, as we continue to move the city forward, we continue to see unprecedented development and growth, that we're talking to one another on transportation solutions. And if that's happening, great. We just sort of see each other all the time, and we just don't always get caught up on everything, but all I ask is that we continue to keep, city officials in the loop. There's so much that government can do. We obviously need our private partners, clearly consultants that are in that arena as well, that have those existing relationships. If we continue to have a coordinated effort and continue to have conversations, and I think that's going to help us in the long run. What we're seeing and hearing, particularly down around the waterfront in the light of last year's set of storms, is that individual sort of buildings and/or condo owners, they're hiring their own environmental consultants just to kind of get brought up to speed on what they should and shouldn't be doing. And then obviously we have environmental folks from the city and from the state. So if everyone's operating in their own silo with their own consultant, I'm not quite sure that that's going to be healthy when it comes to sort of making decisions. But that's kind of where we're at. Yeah. And I'd venture to say that, the consortium of stakeholders that have their own, the private shuttles that, as described as, in a BCEC probably has done it better than anybody, as Mark's described, in terms of consolidating that, going from, almost probably 40 of them, I think, at one point, down to a dozen, which is good stuff. Yeah. But it's just, that's the type of stuff. But if everyone's sort of operating on their own and just worried about their own self-interest and not, at least the courtesy heads up, and there will be times of conflict. I know we're dealing with obviously with Massport, the vehicles originating from Conley Terminal going onto the bypass road, and then our hope would be into the interchange and/or onto the bypass road that was explained earlier. And now there's going to be a sort of a different idea, at least is being discussed, as to crossing Summer Street and going down and getting onto Cipher, and now you're talking about the Cipher improvements, and you're going to instantly have a critical conflict point of tractor-trailer chassis with pedestrian, regular vehicular traffic, cyclists. So these are the conversations we need to continue to have. Is that left-hand turn off of Summer Street, is that prudent, or should we find another way to get them onto? These are all the discussions that need to happen, that play into what you're doing, play into what the city's doing, play into what the state's doing. So that's my ask, I guess, on the editorial side, is just that those lines of communication can continue to stay open. Keep Jim Fitzgerald in the loop at the BPDA, keep Chief and Commissioner Pat, keep them abreast of what's going on that you're doing, and there will be points where there's a disagreement, or there will be points where there's, I guess, a conflict, but I guess we can work through that, but at least keep the dialogue going. So I appreciate everyone's time and coming in to participate today.
Yeah, great point. The good news is that there's been, as you kind of see, a lot of collaboration. I talk to these people and our colleagues up on a regular basis, and I have to, each one of them, and again, I'll give you this little matrix of all the things that have been done, got this done. Perfect. I mean, there are parts of the private sector's responsibility where we try to do the right thing, and if it's funding transit, if it's funding water transit, if it's doing right things by managing and making, and giving Pat to be successful, which he's amazingly successful, a chance to run that TMA. But we also want to coordinate, and believe it or not, we're actually coordinating on climate change and resiliency work as well, because your point is well taken on that as well, Councillor. I mean, and so we actually had the City of Boston, South Boston resiliency plan presented to the Seaport Leadership Group. We had to present it to our board. We are trying to coordinate and collaborate in those efforts. Yes, individual buildings are going to try to take actions to make those buildings more resilient. But you're right. We're talking about districts. Districts need to be handled in a collaborative, coordinated fashion. We're going to try to make sure that we do that. And I couldn't agree with you more that the need for collaboration is important. So.
And I think the second panel piece, obviously the first panel piece, the impetus of the hearing was to say, hey, we're aware that there's this $400,000 funds out there that we got to get going on some stuff, and there was some delays in that, but also to recognize that there are ongoing efforts, in collaboration with our chief and our commissioner and Jim Fitzgerald and from the BPDA and Pat Hoey from the Transportation Department, that are still, because we see each other regularly on that, but that we have a critical piece of $400,000 that we wanted to go to work to solve this problem. That was the reason for the hearing, but also to bring you folks in, just to say, with all due respect, there's also other things happening that, we're all in the same boat, trying to row in the same direction. So,
no pun intended.
Very good. Those shuttles, I can't wait.
Right.
Thank you, Councillor Flaherty. Thank you so much, panel. I'm going to make one last call for anyone else who wishes to testify. Hearing none, we'll wrap up in time for the next hearing, about to start at 1. If you're interested, feel free to stay. But thank you to everyone who has participated. This will conclude the hearing on docket number 1273, order for a hearing regarding the South Boston Seaport Waterfront and the South Boston Seaport Transit Strategic Plan, called for by Councillor Ed Flynn and Councillor Michael Flaherty. This hearing is adjourned.